early years, that was all there was. Silent movies were the bill of fare, what people went to see. And of course, they became very much more sophisticated later on, but in the beginning there were the one-reelers, and most of it was comedy.
I think it's the ultimate storytelling. You don't need words.
I would think French, although I don't speak the language, but you know, that's where the cinema was born. And when you say silent movies, you would think Georges Méliès, you would think, you know, Lumiere brothers.
D.W. Griffith, who really found pretty much the most innovative filmmaker, arguably, of all time, discovered the storytelling process. And when you have a limitation of how you can tell that story, you don't let those limitations hinder you, but rather you exploit them to your own purpose.
The Great Train Robbery by the Porter dude.
Well, I always liked silent movies because film is a very visual medium, and with silent films, I mean, because the music's going to be different, like depending on which theater you're in. The common held theatrical experience is only the visual.
Just to see something at its simplest form was actually really interesting. We studied about the history of Nickelodeon and how it really was an introduction to a new medium of entertainment.
I was always very impressed by how you can transmit your idea, the idea that comes to your mind, you can put it onto a piece of film without any sound. We are so used to sounds now, we rely on them. These people got their message across without sound, with pantomime, with just camera images. It was very impressive to me.
So silent films, in my opinion, represent the older stylings of what it was to give birth to an art form that was so precious and pure at one point in time.
Get rid of all words. Today, we don't need it. We just don't need words.
Without any sound. Sound is, to me, is 1/3 of the entire movie.
The fact that there was no sound, that there was that innocence there, where there wasn't noises and sound effects to corrupt things or meddle in with the story, they enlivened it.
I believe that they should be preserved. We're doing everything we can to keep them alive.
A lot of the movies I make in school, I mean, they're very dialogue heavy, you know, but I really respect what they were doing in those days, which was a lot more visual. It's very visually oriented.
June 1889 in New York City, a future silent movie star was born. He was named Briscoe Buckman by his Russian, German, Jewish immigrant parents, Max, a tailor, and his wife Brenna, a seamstress. He grew up in a poor immigrant neighborhood, and although he didn't do well in school, he was a voracious reader and earned a reputation for being knowledgeable. His parents hoped that he would grow up to become a doctor or a lawyer, but he didn't have the aptitude for those lines of work, and he didn't want to work as a tradesman in the garment industry like his family. Young Briscoe did many odd jobs after he finished school, but spent much of his free time writing stories and plays. When the Great War broke out in 1914, he tried to join the army, thinking that the United States would eventually join the conflict, and he wanted to be in a good position by entering early before everyone enlisted. To his disappointment, he was rated as unfit for duty because of health reasons, but we don't know which reasons they were, and there are no surviving records of his enlistment due to a fire at the Veterans Bureau in the 1950s. His ambition was to be an author of novels, but the Nickelodeons held a fascination to him which was impossible to dismiss. His good friend from school, Lawrence Gold, sent him a train ticket and a promise of employment in Hollywood, so against his family's wishes, he left in 1914 to be a writer in Hollywood. Arriving in Hollywood, he found that he wasn't wanted as a writer, but as a delivery man and courier inside Brunson Studios. While he was grateful for this job, as it paid his bills, he still strived to write the plots to movies. He didn't sell any, and many times he thought to return to New York and maybe become a Broadway playwright. By chance he met with Lon Chaney Sr., and Chaney convinced him to try his hand at acting, so as to get closer to the creative types in the studios. Working with makeup, Chaney created many faces for himself and for Briscoe, getting them both work as background extras and little parts in many films. Finally, in 1916, Briscoe was waiting to do a small part in a Western film, and on the spot acted out a story in which he was writing to the other extras. Making the director laugh, he was given an introduction to the Keystone Company and had the opportunity to be a Keystone cop for 6 months. Physically, Briscoe was a short man, 5'3", and he weighed at this time around 150 pounds. Not able to do all the falls and acrobatics that other people in the company could do, Max Sennett saw use of Briscoe as a writer of plots, such as they were to his comedies. Although for the first time in his life he was making a good living from this, he wasn't given any credit for creating them. This made Briscoe want to branch out on his own. Following his friend Roscoe Arbuckle to independent employment, he worked with Charles Chaplin, Roscoe Arbuckle, and Buster Keaton. It was Keaton who named Briscoe Chubby, seeing him as a miniature fatty and shortening his last name to Buckle. Now, with a suitable marquee name, Chubby Buckle started to make his own films in June 1917. The first film, titled Rust Bucket, quickly made Chubby a huge box office star.
His very first one, I believe, was called Rust Bucket, which he did with his co-star A.E. Belcamp. They were good friends. Rust Bucket, I believe, much of those original prints were lost, obviously, lost for time. They were competing for who could pump the most water from one of those old water wells, springs in the ground. And so they were trying to fill it with this bucket. And Chubby grabs one that's rusted underneath, and there's a hole in the bottom. So every time he tries to put the water underneath, he tries to pick it up and show that he's pumped the most, but it keeps slipping through the bottom, he doesn't realize it. And so this continues on and on. There's a big game going on where he keeps losing water, and finally he realizes it at the end. And so there's little games that he's always this victim of these circumstances.
This was followed by Low Noon, Pig Tall, A Short Ride, and 4 other short films in 1917 alone. In a short time he was one of the most famous movie stars, trailing only Chaplin and Arbuckle in the public's minds as a draw to the movies. Briscoe should have been at the top of his world, for he had succeeded in his ambitions, everything he set out for. But at the end of 1917 he was not happy, he was lonely. A love affair from 1915 ended in disaster when he found that the actress he was dating was sleeping with a prominent director to advance her career. We only know her from the name Colleen in his notes, with no last name given. He had no serious love since then, and his female friends were all married. He was still living with his friend Lawrence, who at this time had been married and had 2 children with his wife Alice. Seeing how happy they were made it worse for him, and he spent all his time on his films. It was Alice who set him up with a date, although he didn't know it at the time.